So we're in the middle of a massive global experiment in home-based work. COVID-19 has meant that for the first time ever, really since the Industrial Revolution, most people are working from home, from their home environments. From in the UK, it's gone from 14% to almost 50%, and it happened almost overnight. And what's amazing giving a talk like this is that actually I'm speaking to everyone else in their homes as well, and I'm speaking from my home. So this is a really interesting phenomenon, obviously, from my perspective. I've been researching the architecture of home-based work for nearly 20 years. So the surveys that are coming out are absolutely consistently showing benefit to the individual, to the family, to the neighborhood, to the economy, and to the environment. So it's a real win-win-win-win-win situation. And I want to just dwell a little bit on two surveys. And the first was done by an organization called Europe Ignites. And they interviewed 620 asset managers. And they found that the companies, these are all across the world, and they found that their companies had transitioned completely frictionlessly from working in the office to working from home. These people were so happy. It was an outpouring of surprise and relief of being healthier, happier, sleeping better, less stressed, exercising by walking the dog instead of going to the gym, enjoying spending more time with their families, etc., etc., etc. And simultaneously, they're finding that they're more productive. So for employers and for employees, this is really working. And obviously for the employers, there's also the issue of them not finding that they're not actually needing their headquarter buildings. The boss at Barclays said he's got 70,000 employees across the world, 7,000 of whom are in a glitzy skyscraper in Canary Wharf. And he says he really doesn't think he needs that building anymore, because his staff are running the company really effectively from their kitchens. That's his quote. So I was giving a webinar in the School of Architecture at Chandigarh a few weeks ago, and so I tested a few of the questions that were asked in the Europe Ignite survey to the audience there, which is obviously a really different demographic. And what I found was that they were very similar up to a point. So they were happier, they were healthier, they were enjoying it enormously, and both sets wanted to carry on doing it after COVID. No one was missing the commute. But that's where it stopped, because the people in Chandigarh didn't find that they were more productive. What they found was that they were less productive because they didn't have enough space to work, and they didn't have enough spatial separation from the other members of their household. So then I came across this survey from that YouGov did in the UK. And I thought, aye, this is interesting. So this survey shows that most middle-class workers have been working from home full-time, but only 1 in 5 working-class workers. So this is an alert, and it's like, okay, so what is happening? And the consequence of this is obviously that 4 out of 5 working class workers are actually going out to work and are therefore much more vulnerable to the pandemic, to catching COVID-19. So this is the stereotype. This is the image that people have in their minds of working from home. And of course, this is completely blown out of the water now, because we're all doing it. You know, it's the handsome man with the MacBook in the immaculate surroundings and the perfectly stacked papers on the windowsill. But in my research, I found there's a really wide variety of home-based workers. And what I looked for when I was doing this analysis was, out of a sample of 86 home-based workers that I had interviewed and made a sort of close scrutiny of their homes, I found 23 invisible home-based businesses in the skilled trades and the sales area. And you can see the range of different occupations here. So this is a long way from the handsome man with his MacBook. And what I found was that these people were operating, they were invisible businesses because a great many of them are operating covertly, like this furniture maker whose workshop is in an industrial estate in central London, and on the floor above he has made an apartment for his family, his partner and their children. This is a hairdresser, and when she became a single parent, she decided that she wanted to work from home, but she hated having the smell of the chemicals and the hair in the house. And so she built a back extension as a salon, but she couldn't get planning permission because she knew she wouldn't be allowed to build a salon there. And so she got it as a utility room. This is a curtain maker's house, and she works in the garage, and it's windowless. And she's very happy to work there without a window, because it gives her so much control over her life. She says the only nuisance is that she can't see when it's raining in order to get the washing in. This is a suburban furniture, soft furnishings manufacturer, and a joiner. And you start to see a theme. The fronts of these buildings are not visible because no photographs were allowed of the fronts of buildings to identify where these people are. So this is just a perfectly ordinary garage with the joiner in it. And this is a motor engineer's perfectly ordinary shed at the back of his bungalow. So all well and good, but these people are all owner-occupiers. These people all have own their own houses and were able to extend or inhabit them as they wanted. But what happens when someone in social housing who wants to work from home, okay, and difficult enough on a laptop, but what if it's one of these skilled trades or sales occupations? And the answer is it leads to incredibly difficult conditions, like this childminder in a one-bedroom flat, and she basically lives in her bedroom because her living room she's turned into her workspace. Or this person who makes, designs and makes a range of clothing for children, incredibly overcrowded, working with her partner, again in a one-bedroom flat with an 18-month-old child. In fact, the day after I interviewed them, the child swallowed a pin and had to go to A&E. So not only overcrowding, but also really serious health and safety issues. Another childminder, this time because she said she really likes to be able to give the children a change in their environment during the day. She shares a bedroom with her youngest daughter, and her bedroom is turned into a playroom for the kids. And another childminder, working in a housing association flat, and she built very small, 3 children her own and living with her mother, and she bought and built this shed so that she could use that for her children. And the housing association told her the planners wouldn't allow it, and I was involved in a project working with this housing association and their home-based workers, and the planners actually were fine about it, but the housing association wasn't happy to do it. And so in the end, she had to take it down. She couldn't use it. And this, in this flat, a person who had underdeveloped literacy skills because her mother had mental health issues and she was kept out of school. So no fault of her own. And she desperately wanted to work to do some home-based work. But the layout of the flat was such that when you come in the front door, you go past the bedrooms in order to get to the living spaces. And her husband was a taxi driver who worked nights. And so it was completely impossible. She had to be as quiet as a mouse during the day when he was asleep. And a person who sold ladies' underwear and children's clothes. And she had no storage. She had nowhere where she could actually set her work out. So when anybody came to buy things from her, she had to get everything out of plastic bags and then put it all away again. So on this last one, a care leaver who was a young man and working as an illustrator, but he had this tenancy agreement that basically said he wasn't allowed to use the premises to run a business from, which he was. And so he had to work completely illicitly. He worked entirely off the internet. Nobody knew that he was working there. And it's interesting if you look at the way in this sentence from the tenancy agreement, the idea of operating a business at the premises and using the premises for an illegal or an immoral purpose are part of the same sentence. So there's really big problems for working from home in social housing. And in order to understand this, I think we need to go back in history and we need to see how social housing developed. So before the Industrial Revolution, it was completely normal to work from home or to live at the workplace. And very often buildings were designed specifically to accommodate it, like these little weavers' cottages with the big upstairs window to let lots of light into the, onto the loom. So people worked in their houses, doing all sorts of things. And the city was interspersed with yards and courts where people carried out all sorts of occupations. And as John Galt, who was a photographer who documented this period, said, these people are not a lower species, but they're just people trying to scrape by. But by the end of the 19th century, home-based work had become very unpopular. And the employers didn't like it because it reduced the amount of control that they had over their employees. The unions didn't like it because they were concerned about an unregulated and exploited part of the workforce, but also they were concerned that home-based work undermined their campaign for a male family wage. Social reformers didn't like it because they allied the issue of home-based work with the terrible problems of overcrowding and poor sanitation that they came across when they went into the slums of the East Ends of London. And finally, there was a very widespread conservative with a small c public opinion that said a woman's place should be in the home, domestic and not income generating. And so the housing that was built specifically, I mean, its primary purpose was to reduce overcrowding and poor sanitation, but there was an underlying agenda of reforming the morals of the poor. And in those days, they divided the poor into two categories, really. There was the deserving poor and the undeserving poor. And the undeserving and the deserving poor were the people who had a person who, a family member, usually a man, who went out to work to earn the living. And these were the people who got the housing. And so the housing, so that the nooks and crannies in the city, the courts and the yards were basically eradicated when the new housing was built. And the tenancy agreements in the new housing prohibited people from working from home. And so we end up with this concept, housing. And if you look at this scheme, 2010, if you actually strip away the balconies and the coloured facades, in terms of form, it's not that terribly different. And so if we spin right forward to today, this is a case study of a home-based worker and of a home-based working family, actually. And it's a young British black architect who said to me, it was not written that I would be an architect, because he was brought up in this block with a single mother, a single parent mother, and a 2-bedroom flat with him and his brother sharing a bedroom. And he was out of school at 15, but his really very wonderful mother found at the top of the block an old caretaker's room. And so what she did was she spent a week's worth of her wages on getting a lockable iron gate put on the front of it to keep undesirables out. And then this young lad was able to use it as a studio. And to start with, it was a studio for making grime music. And then gradually he developed an interest in architecture. And he is now one of London's young Black rising star architects. And it was this space, in a way, that was so unusual in social housing, this additional space that enabled him to actually study and now actually to run a practice, you know, from this very little tiny room. So there are glaring, one of the things that's happened with COVID, I think, is that glaring social injustices have become apparent, and really in housing, it's been massive. If you've been in lockdown in a house with a garden, then to be honest, you've been fine, and I think many people have positively enjoyed the experience. But if you've been on the 7th floor of a tower block in social housing, you've very often suffered from been terrible overcrowding, inadequate space, and these flats are often designed to inflexible, tight-fit design principles, and they often have restrictions on or prohibitions of home-based work. And so the experience has been really, really different. And what I've been interested in is why we've got this disparity in terms of unemployment in social housing, or unemployment amongst the working classes, sorry. So this is a Black Lives Matter issue. Structural racism in our society means that the households that rent social housing are radically different by ethnicity. So you can see only 16% of white British households rent social housing, compared with 44% of Black African housings. And households living in social housing are over twice as likely to be out of work as private renters, and over 4 times more likely than owner occupiers. And unemployment by ethnicity, if you're Black and British, you're more than twice as likely to be unemployed as if you're white and British. And I think that this is where how social housing is designed and managed really comes to bear, because since the 2008 crash, working from home, starting businesses from home has been a really important entry point to employment for a wide number of people. And in fact, the statistics are really extraordinary. 95% of UK businesses are now run from, are micro businesses that are either run from their owner's home or have been at some point. And they generate 1/3 of all employment and 1/5 of all turnover. But we don't design for this at the urban or the building scale. And it's worse than that, because 43% of UK homes built since 2002 have been purpose-built flats with an average usable floor area of 55 square meters, tiny. And they have very little potential to alter or extend, and they generally make very poor places to work from home. And you can see from the examples of the non-computer based, I mean, even as so many people are finding today, working in overcrowded apartments makes it extremely difficult to work from home. So we live in abnormal times, and George Monbiot said the day before yesterday in The Guardian, they demand an abnormal response. So our abnormal response is that we are, a group of us have got together to launch a not-for-profit that advocates home-based work. We want to change the way that cities and buildings are designed, and we want to change the laws and policies that actually define how we use our cities. So we've just launched this, and basically what it is it's a hub for information about working from home, about design for home-based work, but it's also, and its primary purpose is a network. It's as a network of architects, planners, policymakers, influencers, home-based workers and activists. And we're really keen for everyone to anyone to get in touch, to find out more, to work with us, support us, etc. Because we're approaching this as a paradigm shift. This is not something that's going to go back to an old normal. Most people, all the surveys that are coming out, I've yet to see a survey that says that people don't want to carry on working from home, that people actually are longing to go back to going out to work. The commute is a really big issue. And of course, there is a whole climate emergency issue that underlies this, that actually the notion, I mean, some of the asset managers were saying that they were winning 3 hours a day on their commute. And this was making the most enormous difference to their lives, but obviously it makes an enormous difference to the environment as well. So we think that it's really important that this isn't a moment where our collective imagination fails us. But there are really big and radical changes necessary, because our society for more than 100 years has been organized in silos. Things are either houses or their workplaces, and our government is organized around that, our cities are organized like that, our policies are organized like that, and people think in these rather enclosed ways. And of course, home-based work falls between these two stools. And in many ways, I think this is why it's been so hidden and it's so little thought about, even though for the last 15 years, it's been growing really rapidly, steadily. You know, I think we had 4.2 million people before COVID working mainly from home, and millions more working part of the time from home. And of course, this has huge impact on how we think about and how we inhabit our cities and how we think about and design them. So, so it's a matter of actually trying to work out how to undo. There's a sort of massive range of issues that actually obstruct designing well for home-based work at either the urban or the building scale. And the first is the planning system, which is really organized around these separating out the sort of Ebenezer Howard Garden City idea that of functional zoning, separate out work from home. The Japanese have a really beautifully designed system that is organized around impact. And I think we should be looking at something like this. And they've got something like 18 different building types vertically on the left. And they start with houses, and crucially for this agenda, tucked into the house category is houses with other small scale function like store, office, etc. So that immediately means that the designing for home-based work is embedded in the planning system. And so it starts with these least impacting buildings, houses, and it ends up with factory with strong possibility of danger or environmental degradation. And then similarly, the land use zones, I think there are 13 of them, and they start with category 1, exclusively low-rise residential zone, and it ends up with exclusively industrial zone. And you can see that actually out of those 12 or 13 categories, houses or houses with other small scale function can be built in all except for one, all except for the exclusively industrial. And in fact, in Tokyo, in the most tightly regulated residential area in Tokyo, houses are allowed to have a workplace element in them that is either 49% or 50 square meters, whichever is the least. So this would make designing for home-based work so much easier if we had a system like that. our space standards are too small. And I was speaking at an event a couple of weeks ago, sharing a platform with Elliot Kemp, who's the policy team leader in design, heritage and housing at the London Plan, the GLA. And he said, and I was so happy to hear him say, that our nationally described space standards are not fit for purpose for home-based work. They basically include space for a desk, a filing cabinet and a chair. And as people who are working from home know at the moment, working in your kitchen or working in your bedroom is a really bad idea. Most people really like to be able to have a space where they can use, ideally exclusively for their work, and to be able to shut the door at the end of the day. Our binary property taxation really causes a fantastic problem when people try designing for home-based work, as we found with the whole live-work movement in the 80s and 90s, because we have council tax on the one hand and business rates on the other hand, and they're calculated differently. And so if you have a building that combines the two functions, very often they have to pay double. And so that means that people then keep their dual use of their buildings secret, covert. They don't want to have to pay double for their local services, which they feel that they're paying for already. All sorts of policy documents need urgent review. I think the London Plan mentions home-based work. I think it mentions home working maybe 3 times, and it might mention live work once, but there's absolutely no policy, no strategic approach to the idea that people might be working from home, which might mean that they're inhabiting their buildings and their cities in an extremely different way. And finally, the right to work flexibly, the right to work from home needs to be enshrined in law. At the moment, there seems to be a disparity between the jobs that are automatically assumed that people can work from home. These tend to be the better paid, more responsible jobs, and jobs where people have to ask permission. And I think it's only a third of times that at the moment you have to ask permission to work flexibly. And I think only a third of requests are actually granted. And of course, most importantly, designing for home-based work needs to become as automatic as designing for refuse and bike storage. And the Centre for Social Justice has this lovely quote saying, "Social housing at its best, we believe, should be a springboard to a better life." So what better place to start to think about how to design really good social housing for home-based work. And of course, the wonderful Erno Goldfinger got here before us. He in 1967 designed the Balfour Tower, and in this North Tower, at every, I believe, I haven't been in, but I only know this from people's accounts and from drawings, that at every 3rd floor there is what he called a hobby room. Oops, there we are. So this is a rather poor, a difficult drawing to read, but you can see the hobby room. And it meant that this was a room that was meant to be used by the residents for games or whatever. In fact, they were never used. They were always locked. But now that the Balfour Tower is being renovated for use for private housing, of course, they're turning into co-working spaces, gyms, etc. And what a simple solution to actually include in a social housing block spaces like this where people can work. In the private sector, where money and space is not an issue, there are many examples of people experimenting with designing for home-based work. And of course, the Dutch are always ahead of the game in housing. And this is a scheme by May Architects for at She Central in Rotterdam. And each unit is designed, the yellow is the access walkway, so that's the public space. And this shaded area is a workspace. It's got its own entrance. This drawing's wrong. It's got a separate entrance into the living space. And so during the day, these two spaces can work together as a workspace. In the evening or at the weekends, these spaces become the living spaces, and then at night, this is the sleeping space. And so it's a very simple plan with an access way between the workspace and the living, and a sliding door between the two. And every apartment has its own shed as well. Now, isn't that amazing? Why can't every apartment in every block of flats have its own shed? Sheds are such wonderful places where people can do all sorts of things. And some of these sheds are being used as little tiny workspaces. This is another example, again, Dutch, very, very different approach, but this one is social housing. It's a co-housing scheme for musicians. Musicians are often home-based workers, and because often they're poor, and they often have a problem with their neighbors, either because they disturb their neighbors or because their neighbors disturb them when they're trying to record something. So it's a scheme of 32 two-story houses in a ring round a central grassy mound, and the grassy mound contains, I think, about 30 music studios. And so the grass is used to soundproof, the earth is used to soundproof them, and it's used as a place where the kids can play, and and people can hang out and have picnics, etc. Each music studio has its own very well sound insulated roof light, and they look something like this. And I think this, when I was last there, this scheme had 10 of the households had drummers, and you can walk through this central hill. It's got a tunnel in the middle, and as you go past, you can just hear the very, very faintest tinkling of a drum. And so finally, it's not only the Dutch who do good housing, and I want to end on this scheme by Peter Barber Architects at McGrath Road in East London. Obviously, Peter Barber Architects, brilliant housing architects. And this was a scheme that wasn't designed specifically for home-based work. It is social housing, not for rent, but for sale on a shared equity basis. And it's not for the absolutely poorest, but I think households with really pretty low incomes can afford to buy it, because the scheme's been organized so that you can buy a very small amount over a very long period of time. So very distinctive looking. Each house has an arch. They're 3 or 4 story tower houses. Each house has its own front door, either onto the street or into a central courtyard. Half the houses are back to back, which makes it extremely dense. And what Peter Barber says is that if you stack apartments, this was designed for Newham, the London Borough of Newham, and he said if you stack apartments, you lose 25% of the floor area in shared staircases and lifts and in interior corridors. If you make housing, then all that money basically can get put into into the houses themselves. And so there are a number of really quite radical things about this housing scheme in terms of designing for home-based work. Here's the interior courtyard, and you can see You can see that these arches provide a private space for each house. And so it's sort of calling out for a bench. And so one of the real issues about home-based work is social isolation. And so you can imagine very easily that a home-based worker might well come out and have their cup of tea and chat with a neighbor while they're taking a break from their work. These are the plans. And so this is the recessed arch where the bench might go, the entrance straight into the kitchen. And the really clever thing I think about the design of these houses is that there's a single room on each floor. And this means that in terms of home-based work, they can be used in an extremely flexible way. So for example, and one of the things about designing for home-based work is that there's no one size fits all. The 4 variables are the nature of the work, the nature of the household, the amount of space you have available to you, and the personality of the home-based worker. So if you've got a very gregarious home-based worker, they might well sit in the kitchen and work at the kitchen table. It's got a great big window directly onto a public space. If you've got someone who's more reclusive, they might well work at the top, because what's happened with this, what Peter Barber architects have done with this scheme is, unlike a conventional approach to designing a project like this, where you'd have your public realm on the ground floor and it would gradually get more and more private as you go up. In this case, we've got one public space, the kitchen dining room, on the ground floor, and then the living room is on the top floor with 2 floors of bedrooms in between. And what that means is that you've got 2 quiet floors between the 2 living floors. And so as people will really be aware, having had this experience of home-based work, everyone's having this experience, is if you've got 2 home-based workers, you can imagine one working in each place, separated. So you've got the spatial separation, but also the acoustic separation between the 2. The top one's got a private roof space, the top space. And so there's somewhere where people can take breaks up there. It's a space where there's more room. And so if you're doing something like curtain making or an occupation like that, then you could imagine doing it in that space, or if you're an osteopath or something like that. And also, if it's a household where there are children, you can imagine one parent with children on the ground floor and another person working quietly up above without being disturbed. So an extremely clever piece of design of social housing that I think will work extremely well for home-based work. This is the kitchen with its very public table onto the public space, and the living room right at the top, looking out onto the private terrace. So I think, you know, in a way, COVID gives us an opportunity to rethink habitual patterns, in a way, things that we're used to doing. And I think this quote of Nelson Mandela's is really important, because I think that the injustice of the injustices that have emerged as a result of this pandemic is something that we can all really work hard together to try and work to get rid of. Okay, that's it. Thank you.
Great, thank you so much, Frances. I'm just going to stop your sharing. And also I've put a link to your website in the chat bar if people want to click onto it. But yeah, that was such a great presentation. Thank you for taking us through all those different projects. I found the image of the room that allowed the the black architect to then kind of have a space away from the house as like a really important, I guess, like lesson. So we have a question from Nick Walker. I'm just going to unmute you, Nick, if you wanted to ask it.
Hi, Frances. Thank you so much for a wonderful talk. I'll definitely be going onto your website. I'm really interested in the whole experience of working from home. I'm super lucky. I've got a big Victorian tenement flat, loads of space. So, you know, lucky to have a fantastic working from home experience. I'm involved in a lot of social housing as an architect. And so, I mean, I've got so many things going on in my mind at the moment, just in terms of the whole COVID situation. But in many respects, social housing is doing things much better than the private market. And with our buildings that we're involved with for social housing, there are much better space standards. In Scotland, at least, we tend to build kitchens separately from living rooms throughout, so that kids can work in the kitchen while the parents in the living room, or vice versa. So social housing, definitely we need to improve. But the real problem is private housing and private landlords. And if we think of a lot of the council housing now lies in the hands of private landlords who put the rents up to ridiculous levels, overcrowd the flats. And the other thing that I've become increasingly aware of is permitted development rights, and just what's going on, particularly down south and in London, with, you know, God knows what buildings being converted into single windowed one room flats for people. So I'm wondering how we can do all of this with what seems to be a rush to the bottom, and policy in government which seems to be, you know, trying to squeeze money out of everybody. And, you know, even the way housing is marketed, that private housing is marketed as being, I remember going to a housing conference where builders were trying to suggest that young people wanted to live in studio flats. It was a lifestyle choice, which is absolute rubbish. It's obviously cheaper to build. So my question is, how do we do this? How do we change the policy? And even with social housing, we're dealing with funding that comes from central government, which is incredibly tight. And a lot of the money is now having to be focused on climate change and dealing with, you know, higher levels of sustainability.
Okay, so the question is, how do we do this?
Yes, I suppose so.
Well, yes. And this is a huge and really, really important question. And it's something I've been grappling with for 20 years, nearly. And I think when I first started doing this work, I thought I was researching space and architecture, and I soon discovered that I was researching society and systems and governance and rules and regulations, and that actually, well, as well as space and architecture, of course, I'm an architect. So yes, this is a juggernaut that we have to turn. This is a massive oil tanker that we have to turn around, and I think we have to do it together. And in a way, that's why we've set up this Workhome network. Is that this is going to take sustained pressure at every level to get these changes that are necessary. If you saw the list of changes that I said are necessary, it's like, okay, we've got to change the whole planning system. We've got to change the property taxation system. We've got to change space standards. We've got to change policy. It's like, this is a paradigm shift. It's not just a matter of tweaking the edges. And obviously, what would be amazing would be to have an incredibly forward-looking, imaginative government in place at the moment. And what have we got? We haven't got that. And so, yes, permitted development rights, crikey. So the rush to build slum housing, well, maybe. You see, I think this is going to have a really interesting impact on the whole property market. I think that young people who have been struggling so hard to cling on to being able to rent really, really small, overcrowded apartments, you know, multiple people without even having a living room, because one of the living room turns into another bedroom. I think there may well be a sort of collective sigh of relief as people realize that they can move to somewhere where property is much cheaper, and they can do their work from home, or they commute once or twice a week from somewhere further. So I think we're going to see a really big shake-up, and that's why I think people have to have their minds wide open to what's happening and what the possibilities are. And that's why I say it's really important we don't have a collective failure of imagination, because we have to imagine a world that's different. So if we have an exodus of young people from the city, not just young people, you know, families, people who realize that they can go for the same amount of money they're paying at the moment in central locations to be near to their work, they can go somewhere where they can get much more space for the money, then property prices in the center of London will drop. If we've got companies realizing they don't need all these office buildings, then those prices also will drop. If property prices drop, then housing suddenly will become available. My idea for the surplus that it seems that we're bound to have a surplus of commercial properties in central business districts, is that these are the places where the makers and the artists should go. It's very similar, it seems to me, to what happened when light industry left the city all those years ago, and we ended up with all those disused and semi-derelict warehouses. And hey, look what happened. We know how that story ended. The artists moved in and they enlivened those neighborhoods. And I mean, central business districts are dead after 6. So I'm very optimistic, but I think that everybody, in a way, that's why we're trying to build this, well, we are building this network, is we have to see, I think it's seeing where the wriggle room is in every situation. That's what I would say to you. But I am an absolute optimist.
Well, from an optimistic point of view, I suppose if we think about the offices and the big employers on the other side, if they go along on this journey and they're happy for their employees to move out to places that are cheaper, you would hope that they would retain the same salaries and allow people to buy bigger properties so that they could have this infrastructure of working from home. I suppose the dystopian side of that is that, you know, that people end up staying where they are, but the money that the offices put out in terms of accommodation for their workers just gets channeled back into the pockets of the shareholders. So that's what we need to avoid.
Well, I think that I mean, we have some case studies. There are companies who've been doing this for years, and the most commonly quoted one is British Telecom, BT. They started a home working policy, maybe 15 years ago, and I think they've got something like 13,000 home-based employees, and they find that they are happier, healthier, more productive, and they save £5,000 per annum on each home-based employee. They've got a 99% return to work after maternity, and the whole thing is it really is a win-win situation. And so I think in a situation like that, the employer can afford to be generous, because obviously it's very beneficial for them in terms of saving this fortune on their overheads.
Fantastic. Thank you very much.
You're welcome.
That sounds like a very optimistic outlook. Thank you for this. I don't think, unless you have more questions, please holler at me if you do.
But I suppose we've got to be optimistic, haven't we? That's our job as architects, is to try and see a better world. I'd imagine.
I think so, and I think it's our job to it's our job as architects not just to keep doing the same old when something radically different is happening. It would be very, I mean, I do despair slightly when I see projects that are clearly carrying on as if nothing different was going on. I mean, we'll see how people respond to it.
I'm hogging a bit, but if no one else has got a question, I just wanted to make an observation that I teach at Glasgow School of Art in Stage 4, and we've been running a project called Domesticity and Labour, and we had no idea how apt it was going to become. So obviously, you know, when we go back in September, we're going to have students who are going through blended working and working from home. But it'd be really interesting to see the effect on the students' work in terms of COVID-19, and how something that was, you know, something of a dream has become a reality in the matter of weeks. It'd be really
yes. Well, I imagine that all architecture schools will I can't imagine an architecture school ignoring the impact of COVID and just pursuing the path that it was planning to do before. I can't visualize that. I think that, and so hopefully there will be a great deal of imagination and thinking power focused on, I mean, there are a whole range of different issues. I was at a fascinating webinar a week or so ago with a traffic engineer, and he said that that road design is organized around peak road use, and the reduction in peak road use as a result of home-based work was meaning that a whole load of road what they call road improvement projects, which basically is increasing the size of roads and increasing the size and fluidity of junctions, were simply not necessary anymore. And so there's going to be a sort of massive impact on at the moment our cities are generally organized around transport, around cars, around vehicles, more than they are around people. Obviously people like Jan Gale have been shouting for years that we need to start organizing our cities around people, and I think this is something that is really likely to happen now.
I think Franny asked a question.
Oh, hello. I wanted to ask Frances whether there was, she thought, a way we could incentivize in any way at all a change. So the room off the gallery access, finding that space within new housing and existing housing.
I think that, I mean, what's already happening in the private sector is that suddenly houses that have dwellings that have a workspace are at a premium. They're suddenly more valuable, and dwellings that have a garden. And so I think that it may be that the market actually works in our favor here, that that it becomes really obvious that people need to work from home. And that's in a way why I'm focusing on social housing, because the market doesn't do very well for social housing.
That's it. It's the inequality that you're tackling in this talk. And I just wondered, what levers have we got? What tools are there that can be used?
I think our imagination. As architects, the biggest tool we have is our imagination, and that's why I like the McGrath Road Peter Barber scheme so much, because that's just an extremely, Newham thought he was going to build stacked apartments, and he just went, that's boring, I don't want to do that. How about we do this instead? And actually this instead follows the pattern of I have a plan of London that was drawn just before the fire of London, and the McGrath Road plan is very similar. These sort of carved out yards with dwellings around them and interspersed workspaces. So I think that we just need to get cleverer. And I think the real problem is the developer, who have their sort of standard BIM ready 1-2 bedroom flats. But I think they will have to adapt to a new market, because I think what people have found is that these flats have really functioned very badly through COVID, because the two of the most important things that people need as home-based workers is spatial separation between their work and their home aspects of their home, and also acoustic separation. And there's real problems with social isolation and with people's occupational identity. So there's a sort of really interesting brief there for imaginative architects to get their teeth into.
Amandeep doesn't have a question, but he just has a comment. You're unmuted if you wanted to ask it. I mean, not ask it, but say it. No?
Hello. Yeah, it was
Hello.
A little bit cynical. Hi, thanks. That was a really, really nice talk. And I work quite a lot in social housing myself, so I'm well aware, and also grew up in social housing, so I'm very well aware of all the issues you've just discussed through, and I'm privileged enough to have a space in my house that I can use as an office, which a lot of people don't have. But my point was effectively just basically to say that we can't really just, universities and developers are already ignoring sustainability, diversity, regulations, planning, and just reality in general. So this will just be another thing on their list, and we can't just trust sort of people and institutions just to do the right thing because it's just the right thing to do. Yes, it wasn't.
I think you're right. No, I completely take on board your comment, and I think that I mean, I'm optimistic by nature, but in a way, I've been working on this for nearly 20 years, and I have presented to endless governments, and the only one that's actually taken any note has been the Scottish government. The Scottish government actually really changed their regulations as a result of some of my research. And I think that we can't rely on Boris Johnson to do the right thing at all. But I do think that, people will, vote with their feet. And so I think people will. I think that property prices in London are likely to go down. At the moment, housing is very much an investment, seen as and built as an investment product rather than spaces for people to live and work. But if the necessity to be in the center of the big cities vanishes, and one of the most important things that I think in terms of home-based work is what's happened is that the employers have developed confidence that this is possible. If people vote with their feet, property prices coming down, I think that it's possible the market will actually work with us, but I don't know. You could be right. I mean, certainly, the climate emergency, who's treating it like a crisis? Who's treating it like an emergency? But COVID is something that has changed. It has made us change the way we live our lives. And I think being forced to change this forced change is likely to have some impact or other. What do you think? Gone.
Oh. Sorry, he was muted.
That's right.
I'm with you. I'm hopeful. I like to be cynical, and I'm always optimistic about the future, and kind of, if it's not institutions or government, it's the willpower of the individual person and the collective, the community that kind of can help implement and champion change. But I just wouldn't hold my breath for leaving things to be done by people correctly, because although I'm working for working for a developer, but we do focus quite a lot on social housing. I know immediately we've not really taken any steps to think of things in a sort of different way. And you know, and we already specialize in social housing, so I'm sure that's the case for lots of other people, clients, architects working for developers. Maybe it does need individual change in the same way as the climate crisis had needed for all of those things.
I think that one of the really important things is just raising awareness, because I think that people are stuck in such a rut of thinking as the home as somewhere where you cook and you bathe and you eat and you sleep and you look after your children and watch television, and they don't think of the home as somewhere where you work. And the minute, now that we've all had this experience, the minute people are thinking about the home as a workplace, it actually really radically changes how you design it. And so I think that this is, I am hopeful that with this changed awareness will come a whole range of new possible approaches to particularly social housing, but private housing as well. And I think the examples from the Netherlands and elsewhere, Japan's got amazing things happening as well, are very interesting, because it means that there's a sort of model in place that people can refer to in terms of developing their own approaches to design for home-based work.